Our next guest is Martin Bridgestock, and he's actually a senior lecturer at Griffith and a lifetime member of Australian Skeptics, and he teaches skepticism, which is awesome, and I think more universities should prioritise critical thinking. So please welcome to the stage Martin Bridgestock.
Got my controller? Which button is it? Whoops.
Forward, back, and that's
Okay, thank you. Hello, thank you. This is a report on a research project in progress. I reckon I'm hopefully about halfway through it. So don't be surprised to find loose ends all over the place, things you can jump on with howls of delight if you want to. What I'm trying to do is to understand some rather frightening trends. That is, to understand the viewpoint of people who normally we'd strongly disagree with, and indeed I disagree with very strongly indeed, with the hope that I can eventually throw some insight for skeptics into exactly how their minds work and what we might be able to do about it. The key question I start with is this: why do some people and some groups oppose the scientific consensus? What do I mean by a scientific consensus? Well, I don't glamorize science. I work in a building with 70 natural scientists, mathematicians, physicists, chemists, biochemists, biologists. I don't glamorize them. I do respect the work that they do. And if the scientists in any given discipline have done a lot of research, they've argued about which theory is right and which findings should be taken seriously, they've done crucial experiments to decide which theory works, and they've finally arrived at a consensus. Okay, this is the best approximation that we have to how the universe works. My view is that ought to be taken very seriously. It can't be guaranteed to be right. Nothing human can be guaranteed to be right, but it should at the very least be taken seriously. So why, I wonder, do some people and some groups simply ignore the scientific consensus in a field and instead put forward their own ideas, which pretty well by definition would count as a pseudoscience? So that's the kind of question I'm investigating. Why do they do it? What are the reasons? Can we understand it? Now here are some examples, some of which are ludicrous and amusing, some of which are horrific. I'll go through a few of these. I don't have time to go through all of them. You'll all be very pleased to know that the Flat Earth Society is alive and well and centred in London. Apparently you can send some money to them and you can get a Flat Earth t-shirt, and they may also send you an acrylic model of the Flat Earth. I can hardly wait to get mine. So that's a wonderful one. A lot less funny is the anti-vaccination movement, and we have a powerful centre of that, of course, alas, here in Australia. Even less funny is the machinations of the tobacco industry. Now, for those of you who don't know the history here, it's very brief and very horrible. Way back in the 1950s, 60 years ago, evidence began to accumulate that tobacco, on the one hand, was addictive, and on the other hand, was hideously dangerous to health. The tobacco industry did its own internal research, and their research, though they didn't publicise it, confirmed that. What did they do? Did they say, gosh, wow, this is horrible, how can we help? No, what they did was they set up their own pseudoscience, hiring scientists to claim that the matter was not settled. There was insufficient evidence, that in fact no action could be taken because we didn't know enough about the effects of tobacco. And as a result of that smokescreen campaign, that pseudoscience, action was put off for about 40 or 50 years. And the results, of course, were the death of millions of people, often in quite horrible ways. Pseudoscience is not necessarily funny. Let's have a look at a few others. Einstein was wrong. If you look on the websites, you will find little societies devoted to the proposition that Einstein was in fact wrong. If you read them closely, it gets a little bit less amusing because it's quite clear there's a strain of anti-Semitism there. Einstein, of course, was Jewish by background, and that comes through. Three of the earliest forms of pseudoscience are the ones here. It turns out that many industries have developed a whole strategy for opposing science. That is, if there are scientific results which indicate that an industry is in some way dangerous, then they can create a smokescreen. The first of these was way back in 1925. It concerned the addition of tetraethyl lead to petrol to remove the embarrassing knock effect. And the older people here, like me, can probably remember when lead was routinely added to petrol in our country. And again, the Kehoe paradigm, which essentially involved demanding to see the evidence, picking on any flaws or weaknesses in the evidence, and at the same time pointing very strongly to the short-term advantages of carrying on putting lead in petrol. It bought the lead industry about 40 years of adding lead to petrol. Not very funny. But there were cases just as early as that. Lyshenkoism, for anyone who doesn't know about it. Lyshenko was a rather mad plant scientist in the Soviet Union. Among other things, he didn't believe in evolution, and he didn't believe in genes. His ideas were taken up and supported by Joe Stalin, the dictator, and as a result, the scientists in the Soviet Union in the relevant fields were rapidly terrorized into falling in line with what Lyshenko said. At least one, Nikolai Vavilov, actually lost his life because he opposed Lyshenkoism. Aryan science is the idea that only science done by Aryans, this of course comes from Nazi Germany, can be valid, which is really rather stupid because Einstein of course was Jewish by background, Niels Bohr was technically Jewish, his mother was Jewish, therefore they disregarded some of the major scientists of the day. Again, not very funny. So there are many examples of flat earthers, of this of pseudoscience, and the danger. The question I am to ask is, what drives them and what makes them influential and dangerous, as opposed to simply being ludicrous? Well, I tried to start off with a simple and logical start. In order to adopt an anti-science position, that is to maintain that your ideas are better than those of a scientific consensus, you need at least one of two attributes. You've got to regard the scientific consensus, for whatever reason, as being less than compelling, or, and preferably both, you've got to have some very good reason, or at least it seems to you a good reason, for accepting an anti-scientific belief. If the two get together, so much the better. Why would you regard a scientific consensus as being less than compelling? Well, there's a few reasons. One reason, which is very simple and very bad, is ignorance of science. If you go to the National Science Foundation of the United States website, they summarize a whole series of surveys of the public knowledge of how science works. Only a minority of people actually can say anything reasonably approximating to a description of how science works. The figures, I think, is about 30%. So many people are profoundly ignorant of science and its methods. And if you don't understand science and its methods, clearly you can't understand why scientific methods should be taken seriously. Secondly, there's ignorance of scientific evidence. People don't know what counts as evidence and what doesn't. When Susan Clancy, the American psychologist, was researching UFO abductees, she went and talked to many groups of people who had been abducted by aliens. And what she found was they had no idea what counted as evidence. Somebody's anecdote or somebody's dream was taken as evidence that, in fact, somebody had been abducted by aliens. So there's a remarkable and profound ignorance of science in the larger community. A third reason, and this may sound even stranger, is a political reason. It's the opposition to science as part of an oppressive hierarchy. Now, the name Peter Tompkins is not among the forefront of woo practitioners today, but he was very prominent. And at one stage he was talking to his son. This is a book by his son, Ptolemy Tompkins. And Peter Tompkins says to his son, "Do you know why we're out here in a boat on the Atlantic Ocean looking for Atlantis?" And Ptolemy says, "Well, it's to find Atlantis, isn't it?" And Peter Tompkins says, "No," he says, "it's about freedom. The freedom to do as you like, when you like, and not get sucked into some artificial system of laws that tell you what to do and what not to do. That's why I'm here looking at this damn road. That's why I've chartered this boat." He equates not being scientific with freedom, and that science is in some way oppressive. I think he's profoundly confusing scientific laws, which describe how the universe works, with oppressive governmental laws. Okay, so there's a whole set of reasons why people might regard science as being less than completely compelling when you have a scientific consensus. What about your reasons for holding a belief opposed to science? Well, there's quite a lot. First of all, you might fear for your life. If you were a plant scientist in Stalin's Russia, you oppose Lukashenko at the peril of your life. If you were in a tobacco corporation and you start to point out publicly that that corporation is in fact selling an addictive and dangerous drug, again, the best that will happen to you is that you'll be pushed out of the front gate. There's loyalty. I mean, I'm sure we all know that the two main political parties, have a very broad spectrum of viewpoints within them. But because of loyalty, they have to mouth the official party line. So in principle, you can get a situation on television, say, where you've got a spokesman for the government and a spokesman for the opposition going at each other hell for leather, both producing their own party lines, which neither of them necessarily believe. That's loyalty. And that kind of thing could spill over into science too. Then you get two ideas which absolutely fascinate me, and alas, I didn't think up either of these: sacredness and natural rationality. Now, when I'll talk about these at a bit more length because I find these very intriguing. I wish I'd thought up this idea of sacredness for myself, but I didn't. It comes from an American psychologist, Jonathan Haidt. A sacred idea is not necessarily to do with religion. It's an idea which in the person's mind is fenced off. It cannot be questioned. The person will not accept that it can be questioned or doubted at all. And therefore, of course, any evidence or argument which threatens that sacred idea must also be doubted, because the prime purpose is to defend the sacred idea. And so it is possible that the entire intellectual outlook of a person can be completely built around defending a sacred, unquestionable idea. Let me give you an example. Let's say, for example, and many people are indoctrinated this way, they believe this, that the Bible, or at least one particular version of the Bible, is the Word of God, it's revealed, it's completely correct, and it points to a young created earth. As we know, there are millions of people who do believe that. Well, then obviously a lot of things follow. You can't accept textual analysis of the Bible, which might examine where it comes from, where the different books are, why they take the form they do, and so on. It's just not possible. You cannot accept any scientific indications of an old Earth. They must be wrong by definition. Radioactive dating methods, and there's about 18 of them, I believe, all of them must be wrong. If somebody finds contradictions and falsehoods in the Bible, that must be wrong too. And it also follows that you have to indoctrinate your children in the appropriate doctrines in order to save them from hell. So if you have a sacred idea in your mind, it doesn't just sit there. Well, some of them might. If you have a sacred view that the Loch Ness Monster exists, it's not very likely to affect the rest of your thought. But if it's something like fundamentalism and young earth creationism, it is likely to spread out throughout your mind and to affect the rest of your mind and the rest of your thinking. Now that's why sacred ideas are so terribly dangerous in some contexts. Do we see sacredness in a lot of dissidents? Yes, we do. Here's a few examples. Top left is Ken Ham. Now, Ken Ham, in his current position of glory as boss of the Creationist Museum in Kentucky, USA, I briefly did meet him actually when he was working in a rather grotty warehouse in Sunnybank in South Brisbane. And creation scientists accept literally the interpretation of the Bible as being God's word and indicating that the earth is young. And that to them is unquestionable. You can't argue with it, you can't reason with it. They feel as if it's a foundation of their very being. They will defend it as ferociously as they can. Now, David Irving isn't anti-science, but he is a dissident historian. And he appears to have had a profound spiritual experience when he visited Hitler's mountaintop retreat in Germany. And the spiritual experience indicated to him that his life's work was to show that Hitler was not guilty of the terrible things that were said about him. This was, if you like, Irving's sacred idea. So his first maneuver was to write Hitler's War. Now, Hitler's War said that yes, the Holocaust happened, all those millions of Jews were indeed murdered, but Hitler didn't know anything about it. Then later on, he went on to say the Holocaust never happened. So, of course, Hitler couldn't have been guilty of it anyway. Finally, Lord Christopher Monckton. This one's an interesting one. He's about my age. And he was brought up to understand the glory of the British Empire, on which the sun never set and it covered a quarter of the world. I remember getting that kind of thing at school. I would, of course, take a very humble place in the British Empire, but Lord Christopher Monckton probably would have been sent abroad to administer a large part of that glorious British Empire. So it's not surprising that he regards himself as having been betrayed by all those lefties who gave away the British Empire. Here's one much closer to home. Meryl Dorey, whose name I will mention. I've read through the whole of the AV, I don't like calling them skeptics, network, and one theme that I think is built in there from Meryl Dorey is that she regards the right of parents to decide what's good for their children as being sacred. She doesn't trust the government, she doesn't trust doctors, she doesn't trust scientists, she certainly doesn't trust Big Pharma. And so I think that she has in her mind the uncontestable sacred idea that parents and parents alone must decide what's right for their children. You can think of exceptions to that as easily as I can. It's fairly clear that this kind of sacredness is a menace to science and it's a menace to skepticism. Because if you have in your mind ideas which cannot be questioned, then they can reach out, they can distort the rest of your mind. Second idea is natural rationality. Now, psychologists like the great Daniel Kahneman in the United States have shown that we essentially have, and this is simplifying, two sorts of thinking. We can think quickly, but with a fairly high probability of being wrong, not very profoundly, or we can muster our efforts and try to think very deeply and very hard. Now, quite often, we think superficially about things which actually need deep thinking. Here's a silly example. If you go outside and have a look around, isn't it obvious that the world is flat? I mean, you can't see it curving, so clearly the world must be flat. A very tragic example is the link between the MMR vaccine and autism. If you look on the AVDN website, and denial, not skeptic, I refuse to call them skeptics. Thank you. If you look on that website, you'll find some heartbreaking tales where parents have taken their little kids to be vaccinated. They were vaccinated with the MMR vaccine, and almost immediately you could start to see them developing the symptoms of autism. Now, the problem with that is that the MMR vaccine should be taken at about 18 months, should be administered about 18 months, and it's usually at about 18 months that children start to develop the signs of autism. It's a classic case of correlation doesn't equal causation. But of course, it's very hard to tell anguished parents that. Now, these two go together, because if you don't think deeply, if you don't mobilize your intellectual resources, then it's far more likely that unquestioned assumptions are going to exist in your mind. And indeed, as an educator, I think one of the main things I've got to try to do is to show students how to mobilize their minds so they can, they know in fact what it is to think as efficiently as they can about a particular subject. Okay, then we go on to groups and organizations. Sorry, I'm running over, but I hope it won't be more than a couple of minutes over. They're waiting in the wings with a big hook. They're going to haul me off stage. Okay. Well, I hope I've shown you so far that the motives and reasons for doubting the scientific consensus are in fact very deeply embedded in the human psyche, very deeply embedded in our society. They're not going to go away. We might be able to help in some ways with things like, for example, education regarding how science works and so on, but ultimately we're not going to get rid of them. The large number of believers are going to continue. What makes it more dangerous is that individuals opposed to science can get together in different ways. Now, the internet enables small communities of dissidents to support each other's beliefs. And if you've got one particular person with a weird idea in London, one in Sydney, one in New York, they can get together, create a website, and it really looks as though they're a substantial movement, whereas in fact it's just a few mistaken people. Much more dangerous is when the when the pseudoscientists can mobilize support. Perhaps the most terrifying example of this was creation science. You have tens of millions of supporters of creation science in the United States, and there are more in this country than you might think. And of course they can be tapped for political support, they can also be tapped for financial support. And as a result, you then have a movement which is extremely dangerous to science. In addition, and I've given the examples of the tobacco industry and the lead industry, and also I'd say today the climate change issue, some anti-science claims can then get backing from business groups or from governments, and in that case there is a real danger that certainly for decades, and possibly indefinitely, they can actually halt the acceptance of scientific ideas. Okay, so then they become really dangerous. My personal view is that when a pseudoscientific movement becomes this dangerous, then we as skeptics really ought to give it high priority, because there is a very real danger that it might lead to deaths or to the destruction of science. Okay, these are my tentative conclusions. I said there'd be loose ends all over the place, and there are. The roots of the anti-science movements are very deep in human thinking and in society. They're not going to disappear, and just changing the education system will not get rid of them. Some forms of education might help a bit. When these pseudo-scientific ideas receive backing from mass movements, like the fundamentalists, or from powerful and wealthy groups, or especially powerful groups like Joe Stalin, they can become extremely dangerous, and possibly that is where our role comes in. To pick out the very dangerous pseudo-scientific movements and to subject them to the kind of withering criticism that we skeptics are so very good at. Sorry, I ran over time.
Thank you, Martin. If we have any questions, there is the microphone at the back. No, looks like no questions.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Martin.
Thank you, been a pleasure.
Greatly appreciate it.